In this video, we're going to talk about sports psychology. We're going to make sure that you have a basic understanding of what the definition of sports psych is, as well as some of the areas of focus for a sports psychologist. So the APA definition of sports psychology can be seen on this slide. It reads that sports psychology is a proficiency that uses psychological knowledge and skills to address optimal performance and well-being of athletes, developmental and social aspects of sports participation, and systemic issues associated with sports settings and organizations. That is a pretty hefty definition. And so what I hope you take from it is that sports psychologists do a variety of things. I think that when we initially think of sports psych, we think of psychologists who are working with athletes, maybe in like a one-on-one or team setting, but we're thinking usually like elite athletes who are gaining from the use of a sports psychologist. And that's certainly one of the ways in which sports psychologists work. But what I think is interesting is the piece where the definition tells us that sports psychologists also are really working at helping people see the developmentally beneficial components of engaging in sports participation, as well as looking at involvement in sports overall, and what are the ways that we can increase access, what are the ways in which we can encourage people to take part in it, what are the benefits of individual versus team sports, some of that like basic research side, but also some of that research and some of that involvement that doesn't have to be tailored towards an elite athlete. Now, these are the three basic types of sports psychology, which connects to that definition on the previous slide. You have educational sports psychology. So educational sports psychologists use techniques to help improve an athlete's performance. So this is going to be, I think, what you initially think of when you think of a sports psychologist. It might be someone who's working with an athlete who's struggling in some way. Maybe they're in their head too much as they're trying to participate, and they've sort of they've entered a slump and they need some help. It could just be someone who is an athlete who just makes use of a sports psychologist pretty regularly. They might not be struggling, but they use techniques like visualization or relaxation to make sure that they're performing at their best. Second type of sports psychologist is a clinical sports psychologist. So a clinical sports psychologist is just like a clinical psychologist. So this is going to be someone who is working with a clinical population. A clinical psychologist uses psychological techniques to help someone who is struggling with some sort of psychological diagnosis. So clinical sports psychologists are going to be providing that same type of care, but specifically for athletes. And then lastly, we have exercise sports psychology. And so exercise psychologists are going to be looking at the wider population. It's the health psych side of sports psychology, where we know that exercise is really beneficial in a whole host of ways. We've talked about some of those this year. And so exercise psychologists are going to try to first identify the barriers to exercise access. What are the things that stop people from working out? And then trying to implement behavioral techniques to help people get past those barriers and make exercise a part of their everyday life. Some of the uses of sports psychology are listed on this slide, and so we're going to run through them, and then I'm going to have you watch a video from the BBC that's going to run through how some of these things can be implemented. So one of the things that a sports psychologist works with athletes on is attentional focus, helping athletes really make sure that they're maintaining focus during high stress and high stakes situations. That goes hand in hand with mental toughness, making sure that athletes have skills so that they don't crack under pressure. Visualization and goal setting is a really big part of sports psychology. Being able to see the future that you want for yourself and set measurable goals, measurable achievable goals that are motivating. Motivation and team building. Some sports psychologists work within teams. A lot of colleges actually have sports psychologists on staff that can work with different teams. Obviously, a lot of professional sports have sports psychologists. Anxiety, learning how to harness your body's anxiety response in a positive way, as opposed to allowing anxiety to debilitate you or to reduce your performance. And then rehab, helping athletes who might have suffered some sort of injury. How do they get through that rehabilitation process in the most optimal way?